Most people know that they need to do the most basic due diligence when they buy a property. Either get a building and pest inspection if they're buying a house, or a strata records inspection when they're buying an apartment, townhouse or villa. But how do they know whether they can rely on these reports, whether they're truly comprehensive and will highlight every potential issue? With strata reports, how can you be certain the inspector has been given access to all of the records? And if the report is provided by the vendor, is it, worth the paper it's been written on? Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
Today we're joined by Michael Ferrier, founder and MD of EYEON Property Inspections. Michael founded EYEON back in 2008 because he saw an opportunity to turn a cottage industry into a professional level service. And since then, we've seen others come to market with similar models. On the surface, this seems great for both buyers and sellers, but is it really? What problems arise from scaling a service like this? Are there industry standards that must be adhered to? Do inspectors need to be appropriately qualified and licensed? We'll be covering these topics and more in our discussion today. Thanks so much for joining us today, Michael. It's been a long time because we last met back in episode 10. It seems that's actually nearly 5 years ago.
Wow, that is a long time. Quite surprising, really. Where's that time gone?
I don't know. We've had a pandemic since then.
Yeah, multiple property cycles, the up of 2017, 18, the downturn, back up, what we're seeing today. I think that'd be a good place to start, to be honest, Mike. I mean, we spoke very briefly offline before this chat, and just how, not so much like, are you busy or are you not busy, but how consumer and agent behaviour changes in towards sort of due diligence and sort of, people's appetite for getting reports. And I think that's quite fascinating because, people try to stop, save money at times like now when, it's even more important when there's, less quality on the market to be, and building prices are through the roof. You want to be even more certain that, you're doing your due diligence. So how are you seeing things change at the two levels?
Well, in theory, the balance has shifted towards buyers. And so they should be in a stronger position to insist on, due diligence and all of that sort of stuff. Agents, on the other hand, or sellers and agents, if you group them together, seem to be more worried about losing buyers. Buyers are harder to find. This is a generalisation. Obviously, different parts of the market will be different, but buyers seem a bit harder to find, and so agents get very worried if a buyer walks away because it's not so easy to sell that property as it was even 12 months ago or even 6 or 7 months ago. So that's interesting, and certainly what we've seen on the sell side is agents are being much more price sensitive about the vendor's contribution or their contribution to due diligence reports, which I think is dangerous because, you get what you pay for in most cases.
Can we just wind that back a little bit? Because, when I was a sales agent, when I was young, all that time ago, the buyers all bought their own individual building pests or strata reports, right? And there was, and so there was an automatic delay put into the system as well. I mean, nearly everything we sold was auction anyway, but even in a private treaty negotiation, people needed time to get the inspector booked, the inspector to do the inspection, and then obviously to write the report. And with strata, even longer potentially, because they've got to book in and go and see the access to records. But then there's this sort of influx of vendor paid reports. So that is where the agent suggested to the vendor as an aid to selling process, whether it's because it speeds buyers up and they don't need to slow things down to go and get their own reports, or whether it removes a barrier. I think that was one agency that has their sales pitch is to provide free reports to all buyers. I think they were removing a barrier that might stop somebody participating at an auction or perhaps making an offer. But then that leads into a whole new array of things. So instead of the buyer and maybe 10 different reports being done on one property in a hot market and maybe 2 in a slow market, and everybody paying for their own individual report, and building inspectors even not, they might want to on-sell the report, but it's not as easy because their contract is with the buyer and the buyer's not going to actually let them on-sell that report, all that sort of stuff. And now you've got aggregators effectively like your business that says, right, well, we'll have one inspection done for the property and everyone can either get it for free, depending on what the model is with the agent, or you can pay full whack and get a refund if you don't buy it, or perhaps you can pay $29 and then you pay a top-up if you do buy it. There's all these sort of different models out there. And I guess what it has taken the building and pest inspection report and perhaps the strata inspection report away from being a due diligence document to being a marketing document, like part of the marketing assets of the sales agent. So that in that changes the way people perceive the value of it and also whether or not they want to pay for it. So I guess in what you're saying there, when the market slows down and if agents start to be more price sensitive, they're viewing it as a marketing tool and they're not going to get their bang for money back, right?
Well, yeah. Well, the first thing I should say is that, I'll take some of the blame for that because we were the first business to offer the vendor side services. The reason that we did it primarily was that because buyers, particularly in the Sydney market, were operating in an auction environment and they had to do all their due diligence before they could even bid. At $500 or $600 or $300 odd for a strata report, but $600 for a building and pest, you have a situation where people were spending a lot of money doing due diligence on a property they perhaps even weren't in the running for. And so we introduced a service that would provide a quicker and cheaper way for buyers to access the due diligence. The intention, of course, was for it to be exactly the same report that it was when it was buyer-generated.
Yep.
And I'll put my hand on my heart and say our reports remain exactly the same.
Right.
Whether they're buyer-generated or whether they're vendor-generated. And the inspectors who do work for us often don't really know whether it's a buyer-generated or vendor-generated report.
Right, got it.
And this is a really important point. But yes, there are plenty of providers out there who are doing reports for agents and, they do get pushback from agents in certain cases, and it depends how you react to that. And it's a thin end of the wedge if you start to give way. And I do think that this has become worse. And, I'll talk a fair bit today about strata reports because one of the things that happened during COVID was that most inspections are now being done remotely instead of done face-to-face, as you mentioned before. Yes, you still have to book in with the strata manager, but the access to the documents is remote. Now, that happens a variety of ways, but it means the inspection time, its travel time is removed for inspectors. And so some inspectors are just saying, right, well, I'll just do more jobs per day. Now, that has a direct consequence for quality. We know that from our business. We deal with these inspectors too. And one of the big concerns I have is the quality of information that buyers are getting is falling. And that's a big issue because I think it's the most important information about a property that people can get.
Particularly with strata. We've had quite a number of episodes where we've discussed strata reports, and I guess most recently episode 206 with Nicole Johnson, where we really talked about who was the gatekeeper to information in the strata environment, and also episode 250 and a number of other ones with Amanda Farmer, who's a strata lawyer.
Yeah.
And you would know. And
I did a podcast with her recently on this topic as well.
Yeah, it is alarming that there's no standards for record keeping even at the strata management level. And then of course, there's no standards for the strata report. So as an aggregator, I hope you don't mind me calling you an aggregator, but you guys don't yourselves write these strata reports. You effectively commission people who do that, right? How do you ensure that you've got consistency of approach, of documentation, and I guess how do you highlight what's missing?
So, okay, it's a really good question. And the way that we do that, and I believe we're the only ones who do it, is that 100% of the reports that get done, and all the reports have our brand on them, by the way. We're not an aggregator of different brands. We stand behind every report that comes through our system. But we check, and that means fully review, and that could be 100 or 1,000 pages of documents, every single report that comes in. And where there are document gaps, we chase those up. And then on top of that, there'll be situations where new information becomes available after we've done the inspection, but during the property marketing period. For example, minutes of a meeting that happened a meeting that happens tomorrow, minutes might be available next week. We will chase up and get those, add them to the report, and then send the updated report to people who've downloaded it from us. Now, nobody else does that. That's the way that we achieve some sense of reliability. But the point that you make is a really important one, and that is there is no gatekeeper. There's no requirement for qualifications. This is strata reports I'm talking specifically about here now. No requirement for qualifications, no requirement for experience. In most cases, these reports are being done by inspectors who work for themselves. Nobody checks the work that they do. And often the follow-up support that people who get the report experience is terrible. And that is because where they're being paid a fee on the vendor side, there's no incentive for them to provide follow-up support, really. So, and they're busy. They run their business from their phone, and, it's not that easy to do it. So,
do you think that's one of the dangers of using I won't say their names, but, I've seen it multiple times, different companies with, you apply, ask for a contract, and then they'll send you, hey, do you want to download the building and pest report? We've already organised it through so-and-so company, but it's only $49. Do you reckon that's one of the risks is obviously that, there may be conflicts of interest there with the vendor and the agent, wanting to highlight the positives and not maybe in enough detail of some of the negatives. But the follow-up, the questions, the asking the building, the person who did the inspection, those key questions, that conversation, you're not going to get that for $49. So,
Look, I think if somebody downloads a report from us for, our download price, which is $59 for a building and pest or $39 for a strata report.
Yeah.
They can ring us and ask us 100 questions, and we'll spend an hour on the phone with them if that's what's needed. But I know nobody else does that.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that the follow-up support is the most important part of the process. Yeah. And because if you're buying a house, for example, and you're concerned about termites or you're concerned about water leaks or whatever it is, then being able to ask questions about what the inspector saw is valuable. Now, but with a strata report, a lot of people don't understand the information that's in the report. They might be advised by their lawyer or whoever it is to get the report, but then they often don't understand the information and they just put it to one side and they don't follow it up. And that's the problem.
Well, yeah, I think people misunderstand. Like you just said, a strata reports inspector does not need any qualifications. I mean, are there even a qualification? Is there even a qualification for the job? I don't know. So, you might assume somebody's got a background in strata. You might assume that the person writing the report is qualified to judge whether it's good, bad, indifferent. And because it's, comprehensive, it's complex, obviously strata reports are, and they're boring. I've read hundreds of them, probably thousands. They're boring.
Less. I bet I've read more.
I bet you have too, and I do not want to win that fight. But, they're tedious, and we've got a template that we use so that we can pull out the salient bits of information and really sort of highlight where the bits are missing. But it's dull, and if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not inclined, you're not detail-oriented, and you make that assumption that the inspector knows what they're doing and will flag something if there's wrong, you just think, I tick that box, I got that done, so then I'm good to go and buy this property. And I think that's probably one of the big dangers, because that's not really even discussed. It's not even like, I don't even know. I've heard lawyers say, oh, yes, I'll read the strata report. Unless they're specialists in the strata space, they'll say things like, oh, there's a lot of money in the Sickie fund. That's good. The Cap Works fund. That's good. And without any context,
No, that's right. I mean, there might be $1 million in the Capital Works fund, but there should be $4 million.
Yeah, if they need
because it might be a really big complex, and they've got massive upcoming expenditure. So that might be scheduled. So yes, it can be a bit of a dry topic, but gee, it's as my customer service people will say, they feel really good about themselves when they get off the phone with somebody and that person feels so much better about their process because they actually understand what's going on. And one thing I will say about that is that a lot of buyers get very concerned about buying into an apartment building, particularly if they don't really understand strata very well. But if they understand what's in front of them and you can give them some explanation about what all the information means, it makes a massive difference to their outlook, a very positive difference in many cases. And I don't think real estate agents appreciate that either.
I've got a bit of an example on that, actually. Because I know that there is that assumption that, let's face it, in a hot market, Chris alluded to this earlier, in a hot market, no one really cares. They really will overlook all sorts of red flags to buy the property because they're more panicked about getting into the market or getting left behind, right? Whereas in a slow market, buyers become very picky about stuff like this. And if a lawyer, for instance, will raise a red flag, the buyer is more likely to go, oh, hang on a minute, and get cold feet. And that's the thing that agents don't like. They freak out that they're going to lose a buyer. What agents often don't realise, and not all, but some, don't realise that being on the front foot with this stuff is actually in their best interests. That to be really upfront with what's wrong with the property, it's assuming it's solvable, that is, and I'll give you an example. And one is really the material fact laws that came in some years ago after somebody bought a house that had a triple murder in there. And then they discovered afterwards that that this had happened, and they were able to get their sale revoked. They got their money back, et cetera, et cetera. It subsequently sold for a lot less money. I've known a couple of different properties that have had brutal murders in them that have been marketed by agents since this material fact laws legislation has come into place in New South Wales. So the agents had to be on the front foot about the terrible things that happen in these properties. And I can think of two off the top of my head, and both of them sold over expectations. So whereas that first one where it was hidden and there was all this sort of subterfuge around it, and that subsequent sale was really tinged by the fact that it had this terrible thing happen, but also the fact that the buyer was able to rescind, right? When the agents are on the front foot about something so awful as that, right, it has been proven in court to cost, the price, have an impact on the price, negative impact on the price. When they're upfront about that, it has had no impact, in fact, possibly the opposite, because I think buyers really do respond well to honesty. That's my theory.
I think that's, I think you're right. And I think that's sort of what I was saying before, is that if people understand what's going on, it gives them confidence. Even if that thing, it might not be a good thing that's going on in the building. For example, in an apartment building, it might be special levies. But if they understand, so when people see a special levy for $2 million in a building, they freak out. But when you explain to them that their unit entitlement is 0.5%, and that ultimately over the next 2 years, that special levy is going to cost them $10,000, and that they can factor that in to their decision to purchase a property that's, perhaps over $1 million, right? And so they can make an informed decision, and often they say, "Oh, okay, I can see that now," and they can work out how they deal with that. Yeah. But if they don't understand the information, they might run away. And I do think that one of the benefits of these vendor services is it does allow agents to take a proactive view if they look at the information as being helpful.
Well, if it's reliable, and therein lies the problem, though, isn't it? Because if buyers inherently distrust agents,
Yeah.
and let's face it, I've seen some inspection reports that have been done. I'm talking now about building inspection reports that have been done or commissioned by selling agents.
Yeah.
And in one in particular was done by a franchised building inspection group, right? So we do quite a lot of business with one of the franchisees, yeah.
Yes, franchisees, yeah.
And a different one we will always refuse to use or even look at their report. I won't even open it. However, in this particular instance, a client looked at the one provided by the agent, and we'd already commissioned our one, and then the client put the two side by side, and it was fascinating because the client's one, the one we had paid for, the inspector had gone under the house, they'd gone in the roof, but not only had they gone under the house, they discovered that two of the ground floor bathrooms had leaked so much that the floor's about to give way in both of them. Whereas the first inspector hadn't even been under the house. They said there were no major defects. So, and because the format was identical, I could literally line them up side by side and look at one that had almost no ticks, the other one had heaps of ticks. And so I went back to the agency who'd given that first report away for free and said to them, you got a problem here because you're making false declarations. If people rely on this, I think you're liable. I don't think the building inspector's liable. I'd love to see that tested in court because you're providing that. So I guess that leads to the question too, to you, who is liable with these building inspection reports and strata reports, particularly if they're bought through you or through another sort of aggregator or directly?
So just on that, if agents are giving reports to buyers, and we know that agents do that, they're not allowed to do that with our reports, although some are naughty. But we often find out about it when people ring up to ask questions, and we can't find them in our system. But part of the reason that that's important is it protects the buyer. So they come and they download it from us, they agree our terms and conditions, and then they'll be protected by our insurances and supported by our customer service. So, but if they get given the report for free and they want to ask a question, well, the inspector doesn't know who they are. They don't know who's got their report. They can't be bothered answering questions about it. So there's no service. It's just a report. So I think if you're given a report by an agent, you should trust it a lot less than if you have to go to a third party and access the report, and then they stand behind that report. So I definitely think there's a big difference there.
I mean, do you find yourself, Michael, though, like other aggregator report where it's just basically a war on price? So you're $59. Someone will come in and offer agents $39. And which are a lot less due diligence potentially, or the quality. Agents are like, my chance of sale is higher because A, customers are going to pay $39 over $59, and then B, they're not going through the floors, they're not going through the roofs. They've got way more disclaimers on everything. They're very friendly for the agent. Then they just all of a sudden, there's a huge conflict there, isn't there?
Look, potentially, and then obviously if the agent's dealing with an individual inspector, that inspector might be very reliant on that agent for their work.
Yeah.
And therefore, they can more easily be compromised or feel like they need to give a little bit to the agent. In our situation, it's different because we're obviously working with a lot of different businesses, and we just won't change things. It's just, it's got to reflect what the inspector saw at the property. And access to different areas of the property is sometimes an issue.
Yeah.
Sometimes there isn't access under the property or in the roof. And yes, there has to be a disclaimer about that in the report. If you literally can't get in for some reason, it's locked, bolted, shut, or it's, there's not enough crawl space for the inspector to physically get themselves under there. It's not see that a lot in the inner west, for example.
Not an industry for big fellows, right? You've got to be quite svelte to crawl through those hatches.
Right. Now, so building and pest reports are very subjective in the sense that they're based on what the inspector who did the inspection sees at the property on the day of the inspection. Where a strata report is less subjective because essentially it's a summary of facts about the building, and it really doesn't include the opinion of the inspector very much. Now, if some of the information is missing, And that could be the fault of the inspector, or it could be the fault of the records themselves, and we can talk about that separately in a minute. Wow. It's a separate issue. Then clearly that affects quality. And same if the information that's in the report is wrong, or it omits important stuff because they haven't done the job properly. They haven't gone through the documents properly and found the important bits.
Is there anything to prevent a strata manager withholding salient information?
Well, they're supposed to give access to all records. So in theory, they can't withhold record. There are some questions around legal professional privilege. So if litigation is going on, they can argue that some documents are subject to privilege. But aside from that, all the documents should be there. The reality, unfortunately, is that often all the documents are simply not there, and the strata manager doesn't necessarily know where they are. And that's a slightly different issue. And often that can occur when the building has changed strata managers.
Yeah.
So you move from strata manager A to strata manager B, and strata manager A has to transfer all the records across. And often the process for that is terrible a lot of the time. And so those records, the records that the new strata manager holds, are quite often not complete.
Are you going to the houses, Mike, either your units or townhouses or apartments, etc., with your strata reports? Do you think it's enough just to look at the records, or you really need to then go match that to the building and walk around and take some photos and because there's two options, right?
Yeah, our report is a report on the records, so we don't go to the building. My personal view is there's limited value in getting a building inspection report done on a unit because they can't inspect much of the building, only the unit itself and the common areas. If it's a very, very small building, perhaps they can get on the roof, but they certainly can't get into the apartment above or the apartment below. And so, a lot of those issues are strata issues rather than owner issues as well, although, clearly they are defect issues nonetheless. But often, and I think this is important, is that when you've looked at the records and you can see the history in the building, often that will give you a hint as to what the building looks like. And sometimes when people ring us up and ask questions, and we say to them, does the building look in good condition or not? And they'll say, yes, it looks like in good shape. And I say, well, that's consistent with the records. Their maintenance, you can see there's regular maintenance. They're keeping it in line with their capital works fund forecast. They've got money in the bank. That there's good summaries of what's going on. And so you can see that building is well maintained. And so it does give you a guide to the quality of the building sometimes, even though we have not been there.
One thing Amanda Farmer always says is that when you inspect the records, you really should look at the email trails. So do you include those in your reports?
Yes, there'll be correspondence. I mean, it's a question of including the right stuff. So, for example, there can be a lot of minor correspondence that's really not relevant. What you're looking for is correspondence concerning current issues or issues that are important to owners. Sometimes issues that are important can be around noise or pets or stuff like that, but equally it can be around defects, or it can be around insurances, or water leaks and all of that sort of stuff, particularly in newer buildings. We see that. So yes, they're looking for correspondence for sure. I agree with her. Yeah.
Do you think that with your, let's say you did 100 strata reports, what percentage of them do you think, given you've seen thousands, do you think it's 80, 90% of them are pretty good? Buildings are run pretty well, or do you reckon it's the other way? How big of an issue do you think it is where a lot of buildings are underfunded or underinsured and haven't got have got a huge list of things that they need to be fixing and not getting on top of their sort of capital works? What's your sort of overall take?
I'd say the majority of buildings don't follow their capital works fund forecast or get it updated often enough. And I'd say that's something that need, in perfect world should be addressed. I would say,
I was about to say it's legislated, but we in New South Wales anyway, and perhaps I know you also operate in Western Australia, so perhaps you can weigh into what the legislation is over there. But in New South Wales, they have to have it. Well, it's legislated to be updated every 5 years. But I love it. You got to have it. You got to update it, and often I see that they're not updated. But you don't have to follow it. That's what I think is just hilarious.
Yeah, they did slightly change the wording on that a couple of years ago to say that practically as possible you're supposed to follow it, but it's not that strict. And even though it's supposed to be updated every 5 years, usually the forecasts are 10 years, sometimes 15 years. Right. And so people look at it and say, oh, well, I don't need to get this updated until the end of the forecast period. But again, owners need to take some responsibility here too, because through that period, they're incurring expenditure. And so they should be getting an expert to come in and say, right, well, the future is going to change based on what you've done in the recent past. And so I think they should get updated every 2 or 3 years.
Right, building costs are changing, right?
Correct. The forecast will change, all of that stuff. Then you fight the battle where people get worried that levies will go up. And so that becomes a separate discussion. Is a building with low levies a good building or a bad building? So
I can give a story about that. I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers. And if you'd like a 30% discount plus free postage for my book Auction Ready, How to Buy Property Even Though You're Scared Shitless, and yes, I'm a potty mouth, use the code ELEPHANT at the checkout. veronicamorgan.com.au.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au. Bought an apartment in a building that has a special levy looming, quite a big special levy, and the levies were so small, and they'd obviously voted to keep these small for some time, and so the Capital Works Fund was woefully low. And now they've got this big special levy. So we sort of got across what that's for and the quantum of that and the risks of that being higher than that. But when we negotiated a deal on that property, I reckon best case scenario, the discount we got was triple the cost of the special levy. So it cost the owner of that property a lot more money for not investing in that build and for voting in, it's only a small building, there's only 6 in the building as well. So presumably that owner has voted against raising levies, against, attending to these issues. And now they have to attend to them. And so, we got a substantial discount. And it's an absolute cracker apartment, should have sold. And in fact, the agent told me they'd issued something like 28 contracts and they'd all fallen over because of this big special levy. So they shot themselves in the foot by not looking after the building properly. And now they have to, so it will be done. But what an idiot.
Well, I'll just say it makes sense. If you put yourself in a buyer's shoes, so buyers can borrow 90% of the purchase price, but then they can't then go and buy 90% of the special levy, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're, and most first home buyers are cash poor, absolutely. So they're not going to have a spare 100 grand or 50 grand for a special
exactly.
levy. The concern of what that may or may be, the unknown, which is what Michael was talking about before, that freaks first home buyers out. They need to know everything, right? It's like cash flow's tight. They need to get on. There's a danger zone. And investors can borrow 105%, let's call it, of a purchase price, if not more potentially. But maybe they haven't got enough equity if they use that equity for a special levy, or maybe they haven't got access to equity, and it stops them investing in other things. And so, I think the special levy thing is something where absolutely, if you just get on the front foot, remove that cost of anyone after sale, that's a much better option, right?
Agreed. And I think this goes back to what we were saying before, is that if you're not investing in the building, over time, that building's going to start to look tired, and it's going to need big money spent on it. Now, the fact that it looks tired has got to affect the value of the apartments in that building. And, all other things being equal. And so in the long term, or even the medium term, it plays against the owners to keep their levies low and avoid, updating getting the building painted or upgrading the lifts or whatever it else is that they need to do.
But even if you just want it, like, for example, you said, I'm never going to sell it, so I'm going to hold it for 30 years, so it doesn't matter to me. But you never know when you need to get a valuation on it. And that valuation is affected by what other sales are in the building. Or you never know when you might need to sell it, right? Because your life circumstances change. And that's why other thing I think people get lazy with it. They just sort of, I don't need the val. Oh, doesn't matter to me. It's just an investment property, etc. But then all of a sudden they need to sell or they need to get a valuation, and they go, oh God, actually it's nowhere near as good as I need it to be because we haven't, been investing in the building.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people are apathetic about strata. Owners are a bit apathetic about it. They don't attend meetings. They don't, they don't contribute to a strata committee and stuff like that. And then when something happens, like a special levy, they scream. How could this have happened? And so on. So I do think owners need to understand that they're part of a community. And if you want a decent community, you've got to contribute to the community. So, it's one of those things. That's what you're living in. You're buying into a community.
That's also one of the things that can come through the email correspondence in the strata report. And that is how harmonious it is and how functional or otherwise, the owners corporation is as well, the body corporate or the executive corporation, what executive committee, whatever it's called in your state or jurisdiction. Actually, and on that, sorry, I was asking you about WA before. Is the legislation somewhat similar?
It was changed a few years ago to make it a little bit more like New South Wales legislation. So yes, they have introduced some more requirements around capital works funds and stuff like that. The practice over there hasn't been for people to get strata reports in terms of buying properties. And that's the case in some other jurisdictions as well, which really amazes me.
Wow.
Is that I don't understand how people are making these decisions without better information. But it seems it's just become the way things are done in that jurisdiction. And so, people find it's hard to change people's behaviour.
Whereabouts are you talking about there?
So, the ACT is an example. So they have compulsory building and pest reports, but no requirements for strata. And our experience is that most often people just don't bother searching the records, which I find crazy. In Victoria, there is vendor disclosure. There are vendor disclosure rules that require them to provide some information that gets provided by the strata manager, and that information, while it's useful, is limited. It's mostly around current year financials and current year minutes. It might talk about recent special levies, but really that's about it.
Yeah.
And so, but again, the practice down there has just been to rely on that disclosure, which,
But it comes down to buyers not knowing what they don't know. And so, with that, I think Nicole Johnson was speaking about that in episode 206, if my memory serves me well, in that buyers rely on that because they think that has all the information that they would need. And it's like everywhere you go, like Queensland is a classic. Queensland has the least amount of vendor disclosure, although apparently the highest amount of vendor disclosure for off-the-plan purchases, but for everything else has got bugger all. And so buyers wouldn't even know what they don't know there. Whereas in New South Wales and Victoria for that matter, there's quite a lot of compulsory disclosure or what they call it, prescribed documents that have to be given. And so that's the problem also when you've got people buying interstate and they may be used to buying in their jurisdiction. They go and buy in Queensland, for instance. They've got no idea. They just assume it's the same. It's totally different.
And what cost is your reports, Michael? Like in terms of, you said $59 through an aggregate, like if you with a real estate company that's basically paid for the report, and then you make it, or you do it for free for them. Well, and you say $59 every time.
We have a few different models. So the idea is to make it cheap for the buyers to download the report, and then the person who buys the property will pay a top-up fee. That's generally how it works. So they'll finish up paying what would be the more normal market value of the report if they buy the property. If they don't buy the property, they just pay the small download fee. The vendor will pay a fee, and now that fee, there are a couple of different options we give vendors, so they can pay as little as, $100 or as much as $250 for the report. Depends on the circumstances. Now, if that report's popular, we'll refund part of that money to the vendor so that their investment isn't that much at all. And this is the crazy part for agents, is often the difference between getting the cheaper service and getting a service that's more reliable and so on might be, to the cost to the vendor might be as little in difference as $70 or $100, which is bizarre when the cost of selling an apartment, was probably $20,000.
But if they're going to get one of those inspectors through that they know cuts corners or, basically is in and out in 15 minutes, then, and they're happy to tell their client, look, don't worry, you don't need to pay that extra $70 or $100 because, this one's going to be easier for you to deal with.
You're talking about building inspection reports there, I suspect. But, and I was probably talking more about strata there as well. Look, I understand, and yes, we have seen situations where an agent loves a particular building inspector because they've never done a bad report. I've heard that exact quote from unnamed real estate agents, and so that's a problem, and that's a problem in the industry. That you'll always get some players who cut corners, no doubt about it.
If you haven't done the strata report though, as in the real estate agent hasn't appointed you, just thinking like if you were, could you just do a random report on a building, and what roughly would that cost a buyer?
So if a buyer comes to us and wants a report, then the cost to the buyer will be $330. And then if they don't buy the property, we'll give them a $50 rebate.
Why do you do that?
It was something we introduced very early on when we started the business, was to try and give the buyers something back if they were unsuccessful in buying the property, because at that time it was all buyer-generated reports. And so as I said earlier, they were spending hundreds multiple times. It also gives us the opportunity, there might be another buyer who comes and pays that $330 as well because they are interested in the same property. So what we say is that anybody who downloads the report for that property in that environment gets a rebate. So they get something back, so for their investment in that case. So
it's very kind of you. I mean, because also I would imagine that in a slower market where you don't have 10 people taking building and pest inspections for a property, you've got maybe one or two. Then the model that you've got is a lot less lucrative, right?
Yes, and look, you're right. There are less buyers around, but those outlier properties where you get 10 or 15 people downloading the report aren't as many as people think.
Right.
And so the way that we look at it is, over the thousands of reports we do every year, is what's the average download on a report.
Oh, this is good. So because you could actually be reflecting what's really happening in the marketplace by average downloads.
Yes. And so in a slower market like we've got now, you do see that average drop, right? But it might be dropping from 2.5 to 1.75.
Right, but still significant.
For example.
I mean, one of the things that we measure is the number of registered bidders at an auction.
Yes.
And so you can only get that from certain auction houses, certain agencies, but it's quite telling. So, yeah, that's quite, I think, quite interesting, the amount.
Does it ever surprise you though, Michael, where you think, oh, that property's got downloaded 15 times. I don't know what people are thinking about with this property. Like the agent's got their marketing down pat, or, severely
just a really popular. Well, yes. I mean, again, this was another issue facing buyers before we offered the vendor service, is that they would think they're in the running. They'd pay their $300 to get a report done or more for a house. And then, of course, the first bid comes in and they're out of the money.
But is it like you look at a property, it's a quality asset, it's, maybe that's to people less likely to download that, because they think it's, doesn't need, like people overestimate the need for a building report sometimes. And sometimes the properties that are in the best condition, maybe they just always get, what's some of the surprises you see, like with the data aligned to the property per se, like, does it just very, just like methodically match up? Great property should be lots of downloads, or is it not really like that?
It's not always like that now. So let's just quickly talk about houses. So a house is on the market. It might be a pretty decent house, but some of the buyers looking at it are thinking, I'm going to actually knock most of this property down and massively renovate it. Yeah. So the building inspection report's not that important to me because I'm going to do a massive amount of work to it. Yeah. I'm going to knock it down and rebuild on the property. So or the person who's looking at the property is a builder. And so they'll say, I'll make my own judgment about it. I don't need to look at somebody else's work, right?
Yeah.
So with houses, and I do think that the average percentage of people who get a building inspection report is lower than the average percentage of people who get a strata report. I think a lot more people get a strata report if they're buying an apartment than people get building and pests if they're buying a house. And maybe that's because of that.
Yeah, like when the people with the house, though, let's say something's just been freshly renovated, do you think people then just think, oh, it's just been renovated, I don't need to get a building report? Do you think that is quite...
I remember an example of this quite a few years ago where we had done a report it was in the early days of us doing reports for agents, and this house had been beautifully renovated, and the building inspector said they'd done a great job on it, but they hadn't replaced the 100-year-old roof. And so, of course, that went in the report, and the agent spat the dummy big time because he was marketing this property as, basically it looks brand new, but it needed $50,000 spent on the roof, right? Because the roof was pretty much at the end of its life. And so that was a great example, if you want, of a situation where the buyer would have been really disappointed to buy this seemingly fully renovated house and then find that they had to spend this money on it straight away, pretty much. So there's traps there, I think, for people.
Oh, totally. I mean, often people they like you said before, they might drop $600, $700 on a few building pest inspections, and then they give up, and then they go to auction for a property that they haven't done a building pest on, because they think, oh, I'm sick of wasting money and I've got no chance of getting it. And then they get it.
Yes.
And sometimes it's Murphy's Law. I just think, well, probably got it because other people did get the building a pest and they knew what they were in for, and maybe you didn't. And there was a classic example of a property I looked at some years ago, and I'd gone through this house and I could smell the fresh paint upstairs. And I touched the wall and it was wet. It wasn't wet paint. Right. It was just that basically they'd just repainted this room, but there was obviously water coming in from somewhere and the whole wall was wet. And I spoke to someone sometime later that bought the property, happened to be someone I knew and had decided not to engage us. And she said that she bought that particular house. And I said, so how long before you had to do something about that leak upstairs? And she said, how did you know about that? And I said, well, because I looked at the house and I touched it. She's like, oh, and she was a bit embarrassed. We didn't get a building and pest inspection, and they'd had to spend something like, I think it was like $25,000 or something, unexpected costs straight up because it was just in terrible condition. But it just been painted up for sale. So, I think people, if they haven't had that experience, they underestimate really what things can cost them in a house.
So I was just going to say the same thing can happen with apartment buildings in that often there'll be unresolved issues in the building. It could be water leaks as well, and that's it's the most common defect in newer buildings particularly, but And there's been, I'm thinking of one very high profile example of this where the issues had been ongoing for years and never really been addressed by the owners. And then ultimately it became an enormous problem. And so, what we went back and had a look, and we had actually inspected the records 3 or 4 times, and the same issues were there each time we'd done it over a few years. And then ultimately, it becomes a really big issue structurally as well as, impact for the owners. And it was sort of all there, but, people sort of saw it as a good buying opportunity probably because these properties were perhaps a little bit under market and they thought, oh, this is great. But really it wasn't great. So
I think one of the biggest things I've literally just looked at my building and pest for the property we purchased a few months ago. I think one of the things I love about it when it's done well is it's sort of your renovation sort of maintenance guide for the years to come, right? Like it should be a document that you look at multiple times, not so much a document you look at, because it's so emotional when you're purchasing. Your brain's got so much going on. What am I going to pay for it? Is it a good property? Is it the right property? Should I buy something else? Should I? And I think you do go through it and check, is there anything major on there? No. Okay, I still want to go for it. But there is still lots of things on there that you still need to fix, right? And I think that's one of the problems. Yes. People just think it's like a one-off cost and there's no major benefit whether you buy the property or not. But if anything, it's just a list of what you want to fix for the next few years on your property.
Yeah, I've often thought it'd be a good idea for people to have something like a capital works fund forecast or a sinking fund forecast for a house. Because, the reason it happens in an apartment building is you've got all these different owners and they have to work it out together. When you're in a house, you've still got stuff that needs to be maintained and there's still a cost for that. And if people actually started saving for that now, then stuff would be more likely to get done in a timely manner instead of being done as an emergency, which is often what does happen.
Or just before they sell.
Or just before they sell. Yeah, the property looks great the day they sell it, but it wasn't great, in the lead up.
It's a good point, and that's the sort of thing that I say to buyers a lot when they're concerned about buying into strata because of the strata levies. And I say, well, actually, it's a way of budgeting to maintain the building, amongst other things, and pay insurance as well.
Yes.
Because in a house, that's all. It's all on you, but it's totally discretionary as to whether you do budget for that or not. And I think it's funny. An old building inspector that we used to use. He's retired now, Peter Mazier, and I actually got him to come on your first home buyer podcast in the first 10 in that. Maybe it was episode 6, I think it was actually early on, a bit like you with this one. And I really wanted him to sort of to talk through from an old building inspector, really through the whole inspection process, what you can learn through getting building inspections, why they're so important, and all the rest of it. And I'd learned so much from him over the years. And he did say that basically the minute a building is finished, it starts I can't say deconstructing. Degrading, yes. So you have to maintain it from the base of the minute it's finished.
Yeah.
And people don't often think of that.
Yeah, no, that's right. Even if it's just cleaning your gutters. I've had a couple of situations in my place with just amazing sort of levels of rain that we've experienced during the last year, where you've had to race out in the pouring rain and get on a ladder and clean out a gutter that's overflowing.
Yeah.
Because, you just forget to do it. We actually do a bit of work with a US-based business called Homebinder, and what they basically have an online logbook for houses. And the idea is that and people who download our building and pest reports, we give them a subscription to that service.
Wow. Yeah.
And the idea of it is that you can set up reminders during the year. So, check your gutters, get your flexi hoses checked, under the sink. These are things that can fail and can cost a lot of money. That's a separate issue. But I've always thought this idea of a logbook for a property is great. But nobody does it.
I love it.
They don't really do it enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally love it. And also getting pest inspections. So people get them before they buy a property, and really need to get them probably every year. Well, it depends where you are as well, but certainly, because God, you don't want pests chewing away on your walls inside.
No, exactly. Precisely. Yeah.
So while we're on that topic, Michael, should we have a property Dumbo for you? Have you got another one? You've had 4 years to think of another one, so hopefully you've got one.
Well, I do have one, and it's goes to this question about strata and the fact that often people don't understand what they're buying into when they buy into an apartment building. And we've had a couple of people contact us and say, oh, look, we got your report, we bought this property, we really love the apartment, but we don't want to be part of the strata anymore. How do we resign from that? We don't really want to pay these levies anymore. We just like to live in our apartment and do our own thing.
Oh my God.
And,
are you for real?
And I'm for real. And it was just sort of really crystallizes that, people are living in this environment, but they just do not understand what they've bought. And, they just thought, oh, well, I'll just sort of leave that. And the rest of the people, if they want to stay, they can do that.
Oh, that does show a lack of understanding as to what they've bought into, isn't it? I mean, there's an obligation when you buy into strata as well to, the owners corporation needs to actually maintain that building, and you bought into, you're automatically a member in New South Wales anyway. You're automatically a member of the owners corporation the minute you buy or the minute you settle on the property. And so you've got obligations as a result of that. So it's so pretty sad. People get thinking, I'd like to opt out now. Not.
But it happens a lot more than you think. People really do. I mean, it's a new concept to them. They may have lived in a house or they may have never owned a property. They're downsizing, whatever it is. And so we have this situation where they just really need to understand how this all works. And a lot of people just don't spend enough time to find out.
Yeah.
It's funny. It reminds me of a story just a couple of weeks ago. I'm just trying to remember. It was literally a client and that had 2 really bad strata experiences. And I was chatting to the phone and she said, no, we do not want to live in strata again. And I was like, okay, yeah. I mean, and I was looking at their budget and where they want to live and, and they were willing to they were literally willing to do anything it takes not to be in strata again. Like it literally had been such a bad experience, both of these. And it was, I guess it's when they get those really bad experiences, you sort of expect that every building is going to have a bad strata, etc. And that's what they literally had built this belief system that, all strata buildings are bad. All buildings, never can get it. Because they've had these 2, it wasn't just the first one. I think it was the second one, the experiences with neighbour. So I've even got a client at the moment who's, wanting to get out, water ingress issues. She's having to go back to VCAT apparently for the 3rd time. And it may likely get thrown out. It's going to go to some other level next year. But she'll go back into strata. But I mean, she's going to have to go into that next thing with so much paranoia and stress about I don't want to replicate that bad experience, right? And so do you see that's where you get that type of client comes to you where they're just so nervous and anxious with the strata report of, is everything there? I need to, because it's the leap of faith, isn't it? Even if you get a great strata report, there's always the unknowns or things that aren't on there that potentially should be on there.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it. Usually there's enough information to give you a hint if there's problems. And that's what I was saying before, that there's a lot of indicators in the records that will tell you whether a building's likely to be a good building or likely to be a bad building, whether it's a history of special levies or whether it's deferring expenditure or whether they've, there's conflicts in the building, they keep rejecting motions, and perhaps you have a strata committee that just doesn't want to spend money as well. They can be the problem.
Yeah.
And this lady's situation where she's had to go to VCAT, I think the example you gave was, then, obviously the owners corporation isn't getting the issue resolved.
No.
Now, either because they don't want to spend the money, or they're trying to get somebody else to fix it, and it's just not happening. It could be the developer, or depending on the circumstances.
In this situation, they just don't want to spend the money on the building. They're just like a mafia, just holding their money in their pocket and almost like hoping she just sort of sells and walks away. But you can't sell because otherwise a fire sale, because this issue's documented. It's been a fight for years, and no one wants to touch it, right, until it's all solved. And it's, this is sort of the issues. I think that's why probably like you say, is to know what to look for in the strata report. What are the red flags? What are the warning signs that, this could be a building that may have problems. Do you really want to take that risk or not? Because it's the stress and things that come after it. I think that's been the most horrible case I know of for one of our clients where they literally are like a prisoner there. They don't want to be there. They want to move on, but they can't because owners corporations have basically got them under handcuffs till they get, and they're just holding back.
That's a bad situation. And sometimes we do see things like that where there's bad stuff going on. There's people who've been suffering water leak issues for 5 or 7 years, and they're not resolved. I mean, and then apart from any financial cost, I mean, the impact on them is, for their quality of life is awful. And if they're an investor, then the difficulty in getting rental income or a decent rental income for the place is a problem.
Yeah, and also not all apartments tend to be affected. So, if you're on the top floor, it's a roofing issue, they're going to be affected. If it's on the southern side, they're probably more likely to be affected than, say, on the northern side of the building. So
yes, correct.
These are issues that can unfairly impact different people within the complex as well. And so it's more important for them to get it sorted out. Whereas others that are not impacted, it's not going to be high on their agenda. So, and this is all part of, community living, really. And like you say, it's getting the due diligence done correctly and relying on the right due diligence is really what these are all examples of why it's so important. All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate your time and sort of coming back on and discussing these sorts of things and bringing them to the attention of our listeners because
Yep. No, absolutely no problem.
Yeah, just people are assuming that, you get these things, you tick these boxes, or if the agent's even provided, that's sufficient. And I think that it's important that people understand, when it may not be. If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.